for it before Bill gets things out of hand. I am live. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for returning for week 2 of what I'm calling our Evil Bible study. So that came out the first time. I don't remember where we were just talking, and it's the first time I said, I got to get things ready for my Evil Bible study. It's like, wait a minute. If you don't know the context, that sounds really bad. So, welcome. Come on in.
Oh, it's nice. Oh.
We have an extra special visitor. You can come sit down. So, thank you everybody for coming again, back for week 2. This one's going to be a little different. If you've read the chapter, you probably got that feeling already. Whereas last week, the priority was on, what is that first question? What's the first thing you need to know? And that is, why are they asking, right? Why are they asking? If someone's saying, where was God, or asking about the question of evil and suffering, are they asking because they're going through something, or are they asking because they want to raise some kind of philosophical objection or something like that? And what we focused on last week was some advice on how to handle it if it's the first one. If it's a situation where someone's actively going through something, how do you address the problem of evil in that circumstance? Now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of shift focus to the second one and say, okay, now what about it? They're raising it as almost a philosophical objection. But I know we might be chomping at the bit. Well, Ken, tell me how these objections come up. I will. In 2 weeks, we'll get started on that, because there's some underlying things you need to know first. I mean, and tonight, what we're going to be talking about is what might seem like a very simple question at first. What is evil? Because keep in mind, the nature of all of these objections, when someone is saying that they don't believe, they can't wrap their mind around the existence of a loving God and the existence of all this evil and suffering in the world. Love you, Liz. So anyway, are we still online? I've got, there we go. I lost it for a second here, but it might just be my connection. We're good? All right. So we're going to start this week. We're going to be talking about what is evil, and then next week we're actually going to be talking about something called the moral argument for the existence of God. And the reason I want to do that before we dive into the arguments, because what I'm hoping to show you next week is any argument from evil, any argument that says God can't exist if evil exists, loses before it even gets off. Before you even look at the arguments, before you even break them down, they've already lost the argument. And they're making assumptions that are inconsistent with the conclusion they want to reach. That's for next week. This week, we're just going to try to define evil. B.A., hold that up for me again, can you please? I do want to say hi to the people we have watching online. Gene Brown and Gail Bright are both watching online. So, and again, if you are watching online, you are also invited to be part of the discussion. We are currently live streaming on both the Trinity Joppa Facebook page and the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel. And so I have both of them up here on my computer in front of me. So if you have a response, you have a thought, anything like that, and you're online, you can type it into the live chat if you are watching us on YouTube, or into the comment section if you're watching us on Facebook. They will appear here on my screen, hopefully. And if I fail to see them, then BA over there will hold up some signs and alert me to the fact that you are there. So yeah, but we can still continue to interact. If anybody's ever watched Trinity Talk Live, we do that on Trinity Talk Live, same basic concept, all right? But I want you to feel like you can interact in the class as well. And obviously, if you're here, just speak up. There you go. You got the easy job, right? And I don't know if Barb's ever going to speak up tonight, because you're always so quiet in these classes. So I did. Barb's already spoken up before class even began. Look, not only do I have it, it's printed out with all my notes all over it right here. It is. We'll get to it. We'll get to it. So, as a matter of fact, Barb, a lot of the questions you were raising in that email were the same, very similar to what BA and I were talking about earlier in the week. So we're going to get to that. Let's get through the rest of the class material, and then we're going to get to that, because a lot of the answers to what you were raising in that email, it's big picture stuff that we kind of have to go through the whole chapter first to address them. So we'll get there. But I wanted to let you know that I got that. All right. So we are on chapter 2. If you're following along in the book, it starts on page 15, and we're asking the question of what is evil, okay? For that very reason, if somebody's saying there's an inconsistency between the existence of evil and the existence of God, we first have to find out what they mean by evil before we can even analyze whether their argument is good or not. So the first thing we always do, of course, when we want to arrive at a definition is what? We look at the dictionary, right? So let's look at the dictionary. This is a definition from Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, and it defines evil as something that is morally reprehensible or arising from actual or imputed bad character or conduct. Have you ever had one of those situations where somebody's like defining, well, what does the word long mean? Well, that's something that's really long or has great length. You know, it's like, wait a minute, wait. You just used the term that you're trying to define in your definition. That doesn't help us at all. Well, this is only slightly better than that. Not a whole heck of a lot. Because evil is obviously a moral term. We're talking about morality, right? What's good? What's bad? What's right? What's wrong? All right? What's good? What's evil? Evil is a moral category. It's a moral term. It's saying this is something that is morally wrong. All right? So if we're trying to define a moral term, it doesn't do us a whole lot of good to just use more moral terms. You know, it's something that is morally reprehensible. Well, what does morally reprehensible mean? You know, what's the nature of that? And so it's not literally using the exact same term, but it's pretty close. So it's not all that helpful. All right. So what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of take an approach that a lot of philosophers and theologians who are looking at this question, what they have taken to try to break it down piece by piece to make it as simple as possible. And the first thing you need to understand is there's two different types of evil. And I'm kind of using the words evil and suffering here synonymously, because obviously if someone does something evil, then that can cause suffering. So they're obviously related concepts. All right. But the two categories that we like to break down are what are called natural evil and what's called moral evil. All right. And in the book on the bottom of page 15, we've got a couple of definitions of different theologians and philosophers and how they've tried to show you the distinction between these two categories. The first one is Alvin Plantinga, one of my favorites. He'll come up a lot. And he says moral evil is evil that results from free human activity. Natural evil is any other kind of evil. Or Gary DeWeese says natural evil refers to the pain and suffering caused by natural processes, in contrast to moral evil, the wicked acts of a morally responsible person. All right. So the distinction is this. All right. We are all moral agents. Okay. You are capable of doing something that's morally right or doing something that's morally wrong. Similarly, you are capable of having moral duties owed to you. All right. The analogy I gave in that regard, which will come up later in this class, is if you're leaving here tonight and someone kicks you into the flower bed, they have done something morally wrong because you are someone that they owe a moral duty to not to kick into a flower bed. If, however, they kick a rock into the flower bed, we don't say they have done something morally wrong to the rock because you don't owe moral duties to a rock. All right. So you are that's what it means to be a moral agent. You're someone who you have moral responsibilities and you can be owed moral duties. All right. Rocks are not that way. All right. Moral evil, then, is any kind of evil that's done by a moral agent, by someone like you, by someone like me, someone who can have moral responsibilities. Natural evil is anything else that isn't the result of a moral agent. Okay, a moral agent doesn't do it. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. All right. And do I have that? Yeah. I'm going to give you, this is our first quiz of the night. Ready? I'm going to say something, and you're going to tell me whether you think this thing is an example of moral evil or natural evil. All right? First example. Joe Schmo walks up to Jack Schmo and punches him in the face. Moral evil, right? Right. How about BA wants to buy a brand new microphone, so he steals my wallet before we leave here tonight. Moral evil. Don't do it. I know you want that mic, but you can be very disappointed in what you're going to find in my wallet anyway. So, how about a tornado rips through a Kansas town? Natural evil. That's easy because it's a natural disaster. That's what we call it. Hurricane. Same thing. Natural evil, right? So do you start to see the distinction between moral evil, stuff that's done by a moral agent, natural evil, stuff that's not? Okay? Now, some people will look at this and say, well, wait a minute. doesn't evil itself, the term evil, kind of suggest that it has some kind of moral responsibility? In other words, if Joe Schmo comes up and punches Jack Schmo, then we can say Joe Schmo did something evil. We're going to sue Joe Schmo. We're going to press charges against him, whatever, all right? But if a tornado rips through a Kansas town, we don't say that a tornado did something wrong, morally wrong, because it's a tornado. And so is that really evil? Or is it just some kind of pain, unfortunate event, suffering, things like that? And I'll admit, that's something I struggle with a lot. I taught a class here a few years ago, and I think it was, a while ago. I think this was the one I did on the God questions, where I kind of said that I kind of personally preferred at the time to talk about, moral evil and then kind of natural pain or things like that, because it really, to me, kind of seems inconsistent to talk about these natural phenomenons as being evil when evil kind of suggests a moral agent behind them. The only thing I'll say is this: in philosophical circles, the answer is tough. This is how people talk about it. Okay, so if you ever are reading something and someone's talking about natural evil, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about tornadoes and things like that. And in fairness, we as Christians can see actually somewhat of a moral dimension even to natural disasters. And what I want to do is take a look at a couple of scriptures here. And these are not in the book, because this is stuff I came up with after the fact. BA talks to me about these things sometimes ahead of time, and I say, oh, maybe I should add that to the class, all right? And so the first one is I want to point out, does anybody recognize, just without even seeing the rest of it, what book of the Bible this is from? Genesis, thank you. Second word should have tipped that off, right? To Adam, bingo. We're talking about Genesis. And what happened in Genesis? Well, Genesis is the book where women were to blame for all the problems in the world, right? I'm not getting out of here alive, am I? No. Don't tell my wife I said that. So no, but seriously, what happened? Okay, the serpent came, tempted Eve to eat the fruit. She ate the fruit, and then she says, hey, Adam, this is a really cool idea. Why don't you do it? And like men have been doing ever since, we just did what our wives tell us to do. And they went, especially when it involves food. I mean, let's face it, any man in here ever had his wife offer him a free meal, and you've turned it down? Be honest. No, okay. So we all know where Adam's coming from, right? So Adam takes the apple, Adam eats the apple, and of course they were told by God not to do this, so they get in a whole heap of trouble. And one of the things that God did, he brought down a whole bunch of what's called the curses, the Genesis curses and everything, the fall, all right? Some of that involved, obviously, us. We are fallen human beings as a result of that. We're not perfect. We are going to sin, all of that. But it involved more than that. Take a look here at what God said to Adam. To Adam, he said, because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return. And then take a look at, I don't remember which book this is now. Which one is this? This is from Romans. Okay, this is Paul in the book of Romans. He says, again, describing the creation, describing the universe. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it. In other words, God said, I'm going to do this to creation. This is what we just read about in Genesis, is what Paul is referring to here. All right, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. So in the future, we're going to have a perfect creation. That's looking forward to that. All right. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. All right. So part of what happened in that fall involved not just us, but involved nature. All right. So all of these natural disasters we talk about, while you're right, we don't say a tornado has necessarily committed an evil act, because a tornado isn't a moral agent. But if we were to trace all this back according to our Christian theology, it does all kind of boil down to the act of a moral agent, Adam and Eve. All right, they did something which then got the ball rolling, which led to all of these natural disasters. And so that's how I've kind of come around to reconcile it myself, where I don't mind so much calling it natural evil anymore as much as I used to, because, okay, you can trace it back to a moral agent origin, even though the tornado itself is not an evil thing. The fallen world, or not, doesn't commit evil. The fallen world was the result of, well, humanity screwing up. Just like moral evil is. But you still see that distinction, right? You get the distinction between moral evil and natural evil? All right. So, yeah, go for it.
Global warming.
Okay.
So we are adding to the natural evil.
If you look, if humanity is doing something that is causing the nature to react in a certain way, and as a result we're seeing more natural disasters or anything like that, then you can see where you almost have a crossover, right, where you have humanity has taken some action, and then so when the human acts, that's an act of moral evil if they do something, but then it can lead to a natural evil, which again gets into why I don't really mind the distinction as much as I used to, because there's a lot of crossover in these types of things. If Superman comes down and tries to start a tornado to wipe out Smallville because he gets mad at Lana Lang, sorry, I just finished watching a Superman show, so it's on my mind, but you get the idea, you get the concept. There can be possibly some overlap there. All right. So now what we want to do, understanding those two categories, natural evil, moral evil, let's really try to boil it down into what is the nature of evil, all right? And here is a big word on the screen, Augustine. No, privation, okay? Don't worry about what that word means. We're going to talk about what that word means, all right? And so this is... everybody's probably heard of St. Augustine, Augustine of Hippo, all right? He was a theologian, a philosopher, late 4th, early 5th century, all right? He wrote a lot, more than 100 different works. Some of his most famous ones you may have heard of are Confessions, City of God. A lot of even modern-day Christian theology can trace its roots back to the thought of Augustine, all right? Now, one of the things he touched on was in his book Confessions, in his work Confessions, he talked about the nature of evil, all right? And what he actually said was, he described it as being a privation. He said, I did not yet know that evil was nothing but a privation of good, that indeed it has no being, all right? There's a couple analogies I'm going to throw out there to help you understand what he means by a privation, all right? Right now, we are in a room that is filled with light, all right? And a scientist would be able to tell you that if you were to look at this light actually has substance. It's light waves. You can look and you can see light waves, all right? Waves of light that are coming out of these light bulbs above our head and that go off in different directions. They reflect off of the walls, whatever it may be, all right? Now, if I were to turn off these lights, what would happen? It would get dark, right? Now, is there such a thing as darkness waves? No, they're not, okay? Darkness is merely the absence of light, all right? If that helps you wrap your mind about it, that's what Augustine is proposing. And we're going to analyze whether we accept what he's saying or not, but that's the nature of his proposal. He's saying good is like the light. It's a thing. It's a real thing, okay? Just like light is a real thing. It has light waves, okay? Evil, he says, though, is the absence of good. Now, obviously, if there's a good goal you're shooting for, all right, sometimes you're going to get closer to hitting that mark than other times, all right? And so the closer you get to that target, the better, the more good that act is. And the further away you are from that target, the more evil that act is, all right? So it's not, Augustine's not saying here that it's an all or nothing proposition. He's not saying it's literally like turning the lights on or turning the lights off. Just like you can have a dimmer switch in a room, right? And as you turn that dimmer switch down, it gets darker and darker and darker as you have fewer and fewer light waves. But that doesn't change the nature of the fact that light is still the real thing and darkness is the absence of that thing. So that's what Augustine is saying. Good is the real thing. Evil is the absence of that thing. It's the absence of good where good should be. All right. And we're going to see as we walk through this why he says that and where he's coming at. All right. Excuse me. So One person who agrees with Augustine is C.S. Lewis. All right. Now, C.S. Lewis, the way he comes at it is he says, look, you've got to decide which one's primary. All right. Is good primary and evil is just a parasite on good? Or is evil just the absence of good? Or is evil primary and then good is just the absence of evil, for example? Which one are you going to put first? Which one is the primary thing, and which one is taking away or adding to that thing, if that makes sense? And he says, obviously, according to C.S. Lewis, the answer is the good. And the reason is this. He says, look, you can be good for the mere sake of goodness. You cannot be bad for the mere sake of badness. You can do a kind action when you are not feeling kind and when it gives you no pleasure, simply because kindness is right. But no one ever did a cruel action simply because cruelty is wrong, only because cruelty was pleasant or useful to him. In other words, badness cannot succeed in being bad in the same way in which goodness is good. Goodness is, so to speak, itself. Badness is only spoiled goodness, and there must be something good first before it can be spoiled. All right? And I think I didn't move on to the rest of that quote. There's the rest of that quote. All right. Boil that all down. All right? Let's talk in easier terms. I don't like heights. I really don't like heights. Matter of fact, since I have two bad knees, I mean, even earlier today, B.A. didn't see this because he was in the balcony, I was down below. I had to pull out a big old ladder to try to fix some of the cameras, all right? I don't like climbing up on that ladder. Number one, because I don't like heights. Number two, because it hurts my knee every time I climb a ladder. And I actually ended up going up my left knee one at a time because I couldn't pull myself up my right knee. Had surgery on my right knee a few years ago. So I don't like heights, never have, not even since I was a kid. Now let's suppose that I see some cat stuck in a tree and there's no one else around, all right? And Superman can't come and fly and rescue it, okay? We're still in the Superman kick. What am I gonna do? Am I just gonna walk away and leave that cat stuck in the tree? Or am I gonna climb up to rescue the cat? Well, if anybody that knows me, you know I'm gonna climb up to rescue the cat, all right? Probably get clawed my eyes out in the process, but I'm gonna climb up to rescue that cat. Do I want to climb up to rescue that cat? No, I don't want. It's the last thing I want to do. I don't want to go up there at all because I know I'm going to get hurt and I know I'm going to be going up high, which I don't want to do. All right. That being said, because I know it's the right thing to do, I'm going to do it. All right. So that's what C.S. Lewis means by people can do the right thing, even if it's not something they want to do, solely because it's right. People don't do evil things even when they don't want to do them, just because they're evil. All right? It doesn't work that way. If you're going to do an evil thing, it's because you want to do it on some level. Maybe it's because you've gotten annoyed with this person, you want them out of your life, so you're going to kill them. Or maybe it's because you want to get a brand new microphone, you don't have the money for it, so you want to steal my wallet. All right? Poor BA, I'm sorry. But you see, something makes you choose to want to do that evil act. All right? That's the nature of evil. So that's why C.S. Lewis is saying, look, you got to choose which one's primary, which one's foremost. And based on this, the answer to that is obviously good. Good is the ultimate quality because we can all recognize it as a thing of itself, as an end in itself, because we sometimes pursue it even when we don't want to. That's not the way it is with evil. Okay? So, good is primary, evil is secondary. Therefore, going back to Augustine, good is the real thing, evil is the parasite, evil is the absence of that thing. That's where they're coming from. All right? Are we somewhat okay so far? So I'm going to give you one more example. And Barb, this is actually my example, not C.S. Lewis's, as you know, to clarify. This is what I came up with. But it's okay. We're going to get to all at the end. You raised some really good points. Let's picture a painting. It's a beautiful painting. It's a lovely painting, all right? But there's a hole in it. Tear, a hole, whatever, all right? Can somebody tell me where the hole is in that painting? You can point. I'll just assume, yeah, right there. There you go. Okay. It's not complicated, right? You can see there's a hole in the painting. So you can identify where the hole is, right? Now, what does that mean that the hole is, hold on, we got, okay, that's just you interacting with them online. Okay, sorry, I saw some comments there. All right. So you can point to the hole, you can identify the hole, all right? But what is the hole? It's a tear. It's the absence of the painting, right? It's not like we've taken some new canvas and put it into this spot and said, now we've made a hole, all right? It's the fact that there is canvas all around it, and where there should be canvas, where there should be paints, now there isn't, all right? That's a hole. That is a privation. It's a privation of the painting, all right? Where there should be something, there's not something. That's what Augustine is saying. The painting, the beautiful painting is good, and where there should be good, there's not. That's when it's evil. It doesn't mean you can't recognize it, just like you can recognize where there's a hole. You can see it, all right? But the fundamental nature of it, that's what we're talking about. The fundamental nature of it is still an absence, a hole, a gap. All right? And that's what he's saying is the fundamental nature of evil. All right. Now, not everybody agrees with this, and we're going to talk about some people who disagree with this Augustinian interpretation. Obviously, C.S. Lewis agrees with it. There is a philosopher by the name of C. Fred Alford, and this is on page 19 of the book, all right, if you're following along. And he disagrees. He says, no, I think evil is a thing. Just like light is a real thing with light waves, I think evil is a real thing as well. All right? And what he says is, I want to define evil as the desire to spoil the good because it's good. All right? So he doesn't deny that good is a real thing. All right, but what he says is, I think there's two real things. There's good and there's evil. And this real thing that is evil, what I'm defining it as, is the desire to attack and spoil this good thing over here. All right? So it boils down to this desire. All right? And he gives a couple of examples. He says, look at jealousy. Look at envy. These are evil things. And what are they fundamentally? They are the desire to destroy the good. All right. But here's the problem with that argument. Is desire, in the general sense, always a bad thing? No. What kind of desires can you think of that are good things? God, desiring God, yeah. What else? Food. Not in excess, but yeah. Desiring food, but the desire for food is obviously a good thing, because if we didn't have that desire, we'd all die, wouldn't we? Shelter, clothing, warmth in this room. I'm sorry? Survival. All right. So desire, when properly directed, is a good thing. All right. Desire, as it moves further away from that proper direction, becomes less good, doesn't it? So you can see where even the examples he gives really are more in line with what Augustine and C.S. Lewis are arguing, because what he's done is he's only pointed your attention to these things down here, these bad desires. But hold on, we're talking about whether desire is a good thing or not. Desire can be good. Desire in itself is a good thing. It's when desire gets misdirected that it becomes a bad thing. All right? And so it doesn't necessarily, in examples he gives where he's tried to say, well, this obviously evil is a thing too, because look at jealousy and envy. No, wait a minute. Jealousy and envy do not necessarily show that evil has to be a thing in and of itself. All right? So then we get into a philosopher of politics. She's actually a political theorist philosopher of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt, who I love reading. Let me tell you, I did not know about her until I was doing my research for this project, and I've just eaten it up. I really like a lot of what she has to say. She's fascinating. As a matter of fact, by tomorrow, I have to submit an article for Lutheran Core where I'm going to be writing an article about her. And it's, I've known about it for like a month, and it's due tomorrow, but I'll get to it tomorrow. So it's largely based on what's in this book. So I've done the work already. I just got to write something up for them. So Hannah Arendt, just so you know kind of where she got her claim to fame, she was a 20th century Jewish political philosopher. All right, come on, slide. Where are we? There we go. And she was assigned the task of covering the trial of Nazi officer Adolf Eichmann. All right? If you know anything about Adolf Eichmann, he was one of the architects of the Holocaust, right? And I think he was caught in Argentina, I think, and one of the ones was caught in Argentina and then brought back for trial on war crimes. And so she was sitting in on the trial, and then she wrote a book afterwards about what her observations were about the trial. And the book was what you see there on the page. It's called Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. All right. And that title, The Banality of Evil, kind of caught a lot of people's attention. All right. Because people saw that banality of evil. What do you mean by that? All right. Because that sounds like you're diminishing the value of evil, or the diminishing the significance of evil almost. And so she kind of explained, oh, no, that's not what I was trying to say. What she explains is, look, when we think of evil people, when we think of the Nazis, what do we think of? We think of, Indiana Jones, right? And the most evil regime on the planet. If you watch an Indiana Jones movie, or at least the first or the third one when he was actually fighting the Nazis, is there any doubt in your mind who's the good guy and who's the bad guy? No, you know exactly who the good guy is and who the bad guy is, right? You can see somebody come on screen and says, oh, that's a bad guy, must be a Nazi, right? Except for the third one when they tried to, I'm not going to spoil anything if you haven't seen it, but it came out in like 1989. So if you haven't seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, what are you waiting for, okay? There's a twist, all right? But anyway, but what she said, what Hannah Arendt said was, it wasn't that simple watching Adolf Eichmann, all right? And here's one of the quotes from her book, all right? She said, as she watched this trial, Eichmann was not Iago and not Macbeth, and nothing would have been farther from his mind than to determine with Richard III to prove a villain. Obviously, she likes Shakespeare, right? Except for extraordinary diligence in looking out for his personal advancement, he had no motives at all. And this diligence in itself was in no way criminal. He certainly would never have murdered his superior in order to inherit his post. He merely, to put the matter colloquially, never realized what he was doing. In principle, he knew quite well what it was all about. He was not stupid. It was sheer thoughtlessness, something by no means identical with stupidity, that predisposed him to become one of the greatest criminals of that period. And if this is banal and even funny, if with the best will in the world one cannot extract any diabolical or demonic profundity from Eichmann, that is still far from calling it commonplace. All right? Here's what she's basically saying. All right, as she watched Eichmann, what she saw was a man who just thought he was just doing his job. All right? To him, all of this administrative stuff he did to kind of coordinate the Holocaust was no different than a lawyer filing a brief or a baker getting up in the morning to bake the bread. It was just part of their everyday life. All right? That's how they saw it. They didn't have, it was characterized by a thoughtlessness. They, for some reason or another, and she'll get into the why here in a little bit, these people never even thought about the possibility that what they were doing was egregiously evil. Never even crossed their mind. It was just, this is what I do. This is my everyday life. This is my job. I'm a good worker. I'm going and I'm doing my job. And so that was, frankly, a pretty astonishing acknowledgement by her, or recognition by her at the time. Took a lot of people off guard because we all like to think of our villains like these Hollywood villains that are twirling their mustache. And she says, that's not what I saw with Eichmann. All right? That's not the kind of person that he was. Now, she took that then a next step. All right? I will tell you, right now, I'm all on board with her. I love this part of her philosophy. All right? I think it explains an awful lot. Then she takes it a step further. All right? And she describes what she calls radical evil. All right? Hannah Arendt would have agreed with Alford, all right, that to her, evil was a thing. She did not think it could be described as an absence. And the reason she didn't think it could be described as an absence was really because of how incredibly severe it was. She says, if you look at someone who is capable of committing such evil acts as Adolf Eichmann did, and to him, it's just routine. It's just his job. It's what he does. That demonstrates a kind of radical evil to her that cannot be described as just the absence of something. We've got to look at that and say, no, that's a real thing. All right, because I would suggest to her, she feels like if we don't acknowledge it as being a real thing, it probably feels like it's diminishing the severity to her. And so you can understand why someone who was so personally affected by the Nazi Holocaust as a young Jewish girl at the time, okay, would look at this and have a very strong reaction to anything that she feels is diminishing the severity of what she experienced and what happened, all right? So I look at her philosophy and I can understand why she feels that way, all right? That being said, I want to pose this question. Can evil be banal, which is what the term she's using to describe, it's just part of their everyday experience, it's what we do, all right, and yet still be a privation? Is she even talking about the same categories, in other words, all right? And I'm going to suggest that it can be, and here's why. Go back to that painting example that I gave you, and the tear in the painting. Does the size of the tear change the nature of it as being an absence? Just because the tear gets bigger, just because our evil act gets more vicious, gets more atrocious, isn't the same thing as talking about the nature of it. You're talking about how big the tear is. You're not talking about whether it's a tear or not. All right. And so when she's describing the banality of evil, what she's describing, and what I agree with her on, by the way, is how is it that people become to be capable of thinking this way, of doing this type of thing? All right. But that's talking about what's going on in people's heads. That's not talking about what the nature of evil as a moral category is. Two different things. All right. Are we getting that? I know this is where we're starting to get really deep and philosophical here, so I want to stop for a second to make sure that we're getting that concept. She's brilliant, though. I love her writing. I really do. I don't agree with her. I see where she's coming from. I just don't necessarily agree that just because it's so severe, that means it has to be a thing of itself. We can still have a debate about whether it's a thing or whether it's not a thing, but your reasoning doesn't lead to your conclusion, in other words, if that makes sense. All right, the size of the tear doesn't change the nature of it as a tear. All right. So one other really interesting thought that she had. I'm just looking to see if I've got any other comments, but I'm assuming BA would tell me if I did. All right, this is another neat quote that she had. All right, and this is on page 23. All right. When she's talking about the banality of evil. Now remember, she's talking about as being part and parcel of totalitarian regimes. She was a political philosopher. That's what she does. She talks about political systems and what makes political systems tick. And so her specialty was totalitarian political systems because that's what Nazi Germany was, all right? And part and parcel, she says, of totalitarian regimes is this attitude of banality towards evil acts, all right? But then she goes on to say this: totalitarian solutions may well survive the fall of totalitarian regimes. In other words, these things I'm talking about that are part and parcel of totalitarian governments may still exist within a culture even when those governments aren't there anymore. And the reason she said is that they can exist in the form of strong temptations which will come up whenever it seems impossible to alleviate political, social, or economic misery in a manner worthy of man. All right? So what she's saying is this: even if you don't have a government that is kind of imposing this type of thought, all right, you can have a culture doing it. You can have a culture that will put such strong temptations on you that you are willing to let yourself ignore certain moral implications because you're feeling so much pressure to do X, all right, to do something, that you have this thoughtlessness. Remember, that's how she described Eichmann. It was really ultimately just thoughtlessness. He didn't think about the moral implications of what he was doing. Well, our culture can do the same thing to us. We can be so tempted, feel so strongly that we need to do something because we have this cultural pressure to do it, or this financial pressure to do it, that we don't think through the implications of what we're doing. All right. Now, I gave an example in the book. You may agree with me on this one. You may disagree with me on this one. And this isn't a class on abortion. I'm not going to go into all the pro-life, pro-choice arguments. That's not the point. This is just an illustration that I personally think these specific arguments that are made by the pro-choice camp, I think, fit into this description that Hannah Arendt is giving. All right? Again, agree with me, disagree with me, but here's the illustration. sometimes, and I know there's other arguments as well, again, I'm not going to go into all of them, but sometimes the arguments that are raised for the pro-choice position are essentially that it's really nothing more than a clump of cells, that having an abortion is no different than removing an appendix. It's just an ordinary medical procedure, and because it's an ordinary medical procedure, it's best left between a woman and her doctor, okay? Well, here's the problem with that. Obviously, when there's an unwanted pregnancy, there are cultural pressures. I mean, let's face it, there's a large segment of our culture, which I personally disagree with, all right, that says, women, you can't succeed in the world, or having a baby is going to prevent you from being successful. It's going to prevent you from having a career. It's going to prevent you. Personally, I think that's insulting to women. You may disagree with me. I'm not a woman. I get it, okay? I think women can succeed, all right? I think there's plenty of examples of that. But there's an attitude that a lot of women I know legitimately feel that there's this pressure. And so there's a pressure to want to get rid of the baby in order to succeed, and let's face it, we live in a capitalistic culture. How do we measure success? By how much money you make, right? I mean, we're not going to get to that political philosophy discussion either, but we're Christians first, folks, all right? That's all I'll say on that. Well, so we have then an example of what Hannah Arendt is talking about the temptation, all right? We see the temptation argument. And so then where's the other piece of it come in? So what happens as a result of that very strong temptation? Well, we start to describe this abortion procedure without ever acknowledging that there's another life involved, without even addressing it. Now, I know there's other arguments that might try to address it, but I'm just talking about these particular arguments. These particular arguments that describe it as just a medical decision between a woman and her doctor, those arguments say nothing about whether or not it's another human life that's being terminated. They completely ignore it. All right, they don't even deal with that question. And so those particular arguments, I think, are illustrative of what she's talking about here. Because what they do is we have a culture, we don't have a totalitarian regime, but we have a culture that puts these pressures, puts these temptations on someone, and now as a result, that person makes a decision without thinking through all of the necessary criteria, the things they should be thinking through when making that kind of decision. Those arguments ignore those, all right? Again, this is not an abortion class. I'm not going to go through all the rest of the arguments, but I just think that particular one is illustrated by Hannah Arendt's position there. All right. So, where are we? We're not there. Okay, so going on to page 24, let's talk about the question of, did God create evil? Now, all this stuff we've been talking about in the class now is all going to coalesce. Why? I told you earlier, I'd explain to you, why does Augustine say that good is primary and evil is just the absence of good? Here's why. Because according to Augustine, if you don't look at it that way, that means you're saying God created evil. All right? Here's what he says. All right? Let's look at a couple scriptures here for a second. The first one is Colossians chapter 1:16. Again, not in the book, it's on the screen. And in the book of Colossians, Paul says, for by him, by God, he's talking about here, all right, all things were created. All means all. All right, by him, all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. I don't know if Paul could have been much more clear. All right, all means all. God created everything. If it's a thing, God made it, all right? That's what Paul is saying. And when God made it, what did God say? Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. This one is in the book. God saw all that he had made, and it was very evil. No, that's not what he said, is it? And it was very good. Put it together, what do you get? God made everything, and everything that he made, he said was good, all right? Which means whatever God made has to be good if we believe the Bible is the Word of God, because that's what it tells us, all right? Now, some people say, hold on, Ken, the Bible actually says explicitly that God created evil. Well, here's where that comes from. We already did that. Sorry, I went the wrong way. Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, all right? Says this, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. All right, I've tricked you a little bit. I said that the Bible says this. Actually, only one particular translation of the Bible says this, and that's the King James Version. No, you're not going to find any other translation that says God created evil. It's just in the King James, all right? So, and I know there's a lot of Christians out there that are King James only. They think the King James is the only translation that's out there. I am not one of them. What I think is the authoritative scripture is the original language. All right? What does the Greek say? What does the Hebrew say in the Old Testament, or the Aramaic, and those portions that are in Aramaic? I don't think any English translation is authoritative. All right? So you always know how to figure out what's the original language say. And in this case, that word that is translated evil is, in the King James, is not translated evil in other Bible translations, and for good reason. Because elsewhere, it's translated as disaster or calamity, all right? In different contexts, it can refer to things like stern discipline, God disciplining someone, all right? And so you have this word comes up throughout the Bible, and it can mean certain circumstances moral evil. It can also mean a disaster, a calamity, or discipline. So the question then becomes, just like we have words in English that can have multiple nuances of meaning, right? So the question is, well, how do you determine what the meaning is in this particular passage? Well, just like any Bible passage, you know how you do that? Context, context, context. If you learn nothing at all from this class, I'm going to teach you this, and that is when you're reading your Bible, never take a verse alone. Like Greg Coco likes to say, never read a Bible verse. And he doesn't mean don't read your Bible. He means never read a Bible verse, isolated, by itself. Always read it in its surrounding context. Try to read it in its historical context. Understand what was going on at the time, what the author was trying to communicate, all right? In this instance, if we look at the surrounding context, what we've got here is God is talking to King Cyrus, all right? And he is preparing to use Cyrus to punish Israel. Remember, Israel had this covenant with God where they promised to do certain things, and if they didn't do those things, then God was going to punish them, right? And Israel agreed, yes, God, we agree that in exchange for what you're giving us, we agree that if we don't fulfill our end of the bargain, you can punish us. And one of the ways he punished them was by using other human agents, in this case, Cyrus. All right? And so he's talking to Cyrus, and he says, hey, Cyrus, I'm going to use you to fulfill that part of the covenant, to punish Israel because Israel's been disobedient. All right? If that's the context, can God mean evil? Because if he does, what he's saying is he's calling his own act evil. All right? That's how you know in this context it doesn't mean moral evil. It's talking about discipline. That's the context of it here. He's bringing discipline. That's literally what he's doing to Israel through Cyrus at the time. So, never read a Bible verse. Never rely on any one particular translation. Always try to find out what the original language meant. All right? So that's, if anybody ever raises that objection, no, the Bible does not say God created evil. This translation does, and frankly, in this regard, it's a poor translation. It's a poor translation. All right. So then we get into, if the Augustinian interpretation is correct, all right, if it's right, if evil is primary if good is primary and evil is the absence of it, then that answers the question for us of, did God create evil? All right? If evil is not a thing of its own, if it's just an absence, all right, and God created everything, then did God create evil? No. You're following Augustine's logic here? All right? He's saying that if God, you can't escape from the scriptures that God created everything. Everything means everything. All right? It's kind of like, I'm going to pick on Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking a little bit here. Even in the modern scientific community, you know, you look at the Big Bang Theory. Everybody heard of the Big Bang Theory? And it's the idea that it kind of acknowledges that in the beginning there was nothing. And then all of a sudden there was a singularity, and then everything blew out of it, and that's how the universe came to be, in the Big Bang, all right? That's an oversimplification. But what's happened since then is a lot of scientists, a lot of cosmologists have there's been other theories that have come up, but none of them can get any traction. They don't have any evidence for it. And so now what a lot of them try to do is to explain how you can have a Big Bang without a Big Banger. Okay? How you can have a Big Bang without someone to cause that Big Bang to happen in the first place? Because, of course, the Bible admits that, yes, in the beginning, there was nothing, and then God said, let there be light, and there was light, right? And so some people don't like the obvious implications of what the conclusions are coming to. And so Stephen Hawking was one of them, and he wrote a book before his death called The Grand Design. And it's funny because in that book, he first starts out in the first part of the book saying that philosophy is dead, philosophy is horrible, it's useless, and then he goes on for the next several chapters to philosophize. And then he realizes he's doing it. But it's like, yeah, okay. But regardless, one of the things he tried to propose was he tried to say, I think that you can have a natural way of there being nothing and then all of a sudden something coming out of it. And he says, so I'm going to show you that scientifically we can have nothing that becomes something. Let me show you how. Let's suppose you have the law of gravity. Hold on. Nothing means no thing. All right? The law of gravity is something. And that's what they always like to do. It's like, no, you're missing, you say it's nothing, but what you're proposing is not really nothing, all right? These words, in a lot of people in our English language, we just play fast and loose with them. We try to say nothing, but then we don't really mean nothing, all right? Well, same thing holds true when it says that God made everything. That means everything. So if evil is a thing, then God would have had to create it according to what we're seeing in Scripture. How do you get around that? And maybe that's a bad way of putting it. I don't want to make it sound like we're getting around it. I think it's a consistent philosophy. You say evil isn't a thing in and of itself. It's the absence of a thing. What God made was good. Everything he made was goodness. Then humanity stepped in and messed up and slipped away from that goodness. Now, here's where that becomes... This is where I wanted to get to Barb's point, because here's what I agree with you completely on, Barb. One of the examples that you brought up and that BA and I talked about was free will. All right, isn't it possible that God, and you were asking me, isn't it possible that God created evil and created good so that we would choose between the two of them? Okay, here's my response to you. I agree that God created free will, and we're going to get to this in a later class. We're going to have a whole big portion of a class on free will, all right? So this is your taste for it, if you want to say that, okay? But that doesn't require that evil and good both be things of themselves, all right? God created everything that's good. That's consistent with Scripture. You know what one of those good things is? Free will. Free will is in itself a good thing, all right? You want an example? Who here right now wants to give up your freedom to do whatever you want? Because if you do, I've got a car that needs washing, my family room needs vacuuming, and I need somebody to get my wallet back from BA. That's the last time, I promise. I won't do it anymore. No, but seriously, does anybody want to be a robot? None of us want to be an automaton because we can all see there's a value in free will. So when we say God created all things and everything he created was good, one of those things he created was free creatures who had the freedom to choose for a lot of the same reasons, Barb, you were saying in your email, okay? Now, of course, as a consequence of that, in order to be truly free, what does that mean? You have to be free to choose what's right and free to choose what's wrong. Because if you don't, then you're not really free, are you? It's not really free will. And so I do think that God does want us to exercise our free will for a number of reasons. God's a God of love. He wants us to love him. He wants us to be loving creatures. Love that's coerced is not love at all. Okay? It has to be freely given in order to be love. So you can't have a world with love if you don't have free will. All right? And so, yes, God does want us to have free will, but that doesn't mean that he had to make evil a thing. Evil can still be the absence of good. It's just that what we've used our free will to do is to move further away from that good through our choices. And we rationalize it through things like philosopher Alfred said, pointing out, you rationalize it through using a legitimate thing like desire, but now instead of just using that desire to pursue things that are good, you use that desire to pursue things gradually. They get further and further away from that good until you're using it to pursue things that are evil, if that makes sense. All right. Any questions? I know that was kind of our first deep philosophy lesson of the class. It's going to get worse. But any questions about any of that? Any comments?
What about the snake?
What about the snake? God made it, but did God... And here's the thing. The snake was who? Satan, right? Anybody know who was Satan? He's a fallen angel, right? All right. Now, the Bible, admittedly, does not give us too much information about the angels. All right. We know that there was a rebellion, that Satan was created as an angel. Are angels good? I would say, based on what we see in Genesis, the answer is yes. God created good angels. He created angels, and angels were a good thing. That's why all things were created that were good. Now, something happened so that certain angels, 1/3 of the angels, all right, fell. All right. They rebelled against God. Now, that much we know from the Bible, okay? Now, that's Bible, here's Ken. Now we're moving into the realm of Ken, all right? We can't say this definitively because the Bible doesn't tell us that. Why did those angels fall? Well, we're not told. Why aren't we told? Because the Bible isn't written for angels, it's written for us, all right? It doesn't matter for our salvation why angels fell. What matters for our salvation is why we fell. That's why it's not in there, I would propose. But do angels have free will? That's at least a possibility, right? Sure. I mean, does the Bible tell us one way or another? Not definitively, but is it a plausible explanation? We're going to get into things called theodicies later, so this is kind of a related concept. Is it a plausible explanation that angels also had free will? And so Satan used that free will, even though he was created as a good being, as a good angel, he also had free will, and he used his free will to rebel against God, similar to Adam and Eve. It's entirely possible. It's a plausible explanation. So then all of that happened before the Garden of Eden. Satan had already fallen before the Garden of Eden came around. So the fact that Satan was certainly evil at that time does not necessarily mean that Satan was created evil, if that makes sense. But admittedly, we can't make definitive conclusions because the Bible doesn't tell us. It just doesn't tell us. But it's a good question. And you're not alone in asking that one. Anything else? Any questions from anybody online? Okay, we do have one here. Hold on. We've got one from, I got to make my window a little bit bigger here. I can't see the comment from Gene. Oh, Gene, we're all thinking alike. I didn't see this beforehand, so just so you know, but this is going to make you feel real good, Barb. Gene's asking, Ken, how did evil get into heaven when he threw out the fallen angels, including the devil? And then she says, believe you're addressing this now. Thanks. Yeah. Great minds think alike, right? Yeah, so we don't know definitively how that happened. The Bible doesn't tell us. And so we can make guesses, and if we can come up with explanations that are plausible, and certainly possible, then what we realize is, okay, there's not a logical problem there. I mean, my explanation might not be right. Maybe there's another explanation that I'm just not seeing, but at least I can come up with something to see that, okay, but this isn't a problem for our theology because it's certainly possible that this is what happened, all right? All right, let me see. That was on YouTube. Let me look on Facebook. I don't see anything else on Facebook. So what I'm going to do here to close out is to give you a brief introduction to what we're going to be talking about next week, all right? Next week, the topic is the moral argument for the existence of God, all right? We're going to be talking about things called moral values and moral duties, all right? A value, as we'll hear next week, is kind of the substance of the thing. What is love? Just like today we were talking about what is evil. Well, whenever we talk about these moral values, love, charity, compassion, courage, all these moral values, all right? Well, what do they mean? Where do they come from? Where's their definition come from, all right? And then on top of that, we're going to talk about moral duties. Even if there is such a thing as love that exists, all right? Why do we have to be loving? What is it that puts upon us an obligation to act that way? Well, that's a moral duty. And so we're going to talk about how we come to those, how we arrive at moral values and moral duties. And then we're going to realize that those can only exist if God exists. If God doesn't exist, there can't be any such thing as moral values and moral duties. And yet, the question, the argument from evil assumes, by even saying there's evil in the world, what's it saying? There's moral values and duties in the world. In order to call something evil, there have to be moral values and duties. And so before it even gets off the ground, it's already making assumptions that show there must be a God, all the while trying to prove that there isn't a God. If that all just went over your head right now, don't worry. That's what next week's class is for, right? All right. Any other questions? All right. Thank you all very much. Next week, chapter 3. All right. God bless everybody.